I am super excited to introduce Becca, not just because we're friends, but because she's an amazing speaker. Is this your fourth time, Becca? It's third or fourth time, right?
I don't even remember.
Yeah, it's hard
Fourth.
the pandemic makes it hard to think about things. But Rebecca's done some really fun stuff with the summit. The last time we were in person, she was a driving force between for Jeopardy, and she was Trebecca, Rebekah Brown, which was pretty entertaining. Also, something I actually quote could be monthly, and people on my team probably know that I have said this, but there was, I think it may have been your first talk for CTI Summit, probably 4 or 5 years ago, and you talked about open source, and you said open source was like puppies. Like, yeah, somebody gives you a puppy, it's free, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot of work associated with it. And that works for open source intelligence, that works for open source threat intelligence tools. So that's just one of many, earworms that when your name comes up, that just pops into my head. So we're absolutely thrilled to have you back again. I'm excited about your talk. You're going to talk about many different things, but one thing that was kind of standing out in my mind is you have a slide on cognitive functions in here. And that's always a big thing for me, especially in the midst of the pandemic, especially if you just look back just over 13 months, if you go SolarWinds to Log4j, just everything that's happened to our community in that time. It's been really tough. So Becca, please take it away. Super excited.
Thank you so much. Yes, free as in puppies is one of my favorite, I think, axioms that I got to bring in, and it was my first CTI Summit presentation. And let me make sure I can click through here. Awesome. So I am so happy to be here today, and thank you so much, Rick, for the introduction. I've said it before, and I'll probably say it many more times. This is one of my favorite events of the year. It's where I have met many of the people I call my dearest friends, including Rick. I believe we met at the 2014 CTI Summit. Katie as well, we met at 2018, 2016. I met Scott Roberts, and it's one of the places where we started working on our book, Intelligence-Driven Incident Response. And it's also where I come to remember that no matter how long I've been in this field, and it's 20 years this year, which seems like a really long time, I always have more to learn. So this morning, I want to talk a little bit about some of the core elements of threat intelligence work. Throughout the summit, you're going to hear a lot of case studies, presentations, even some workshops that talk about how much variety there is in the CTI field. You could be supporting a SOC response to a ransomware event, or analyzing a nation's past 15-year history of network operations prior to kinetic warfare without ever leaving the field of CTI. But what's amazing in this work, and one of the things that I have spent the past few years kind of really digging into, are what are the elements that underlie all of these types of operations, and that kind of bring us together and make us one field and help us learn and grow from each other. And what I've come down to is that we're all tied together. All of these different variety within our field are tied together by the stories we tell, the systems we build, and how well we know ourselves and how well we know our teams. Hopefully you'll see some of your own CTI journey and some of the things I cover this morning, or maybe you'll see something you want to implement, or something you can tie into the amazing talks that we have lined up for you throughout the summit. So the data we use in CTI is often pretty technical, and it isn't always accessible or understandable by all the people who need to understand it. And with the way that we use technology, everyone really does need to understand it. Everyone has potential risks or threats that they're exposed to just by how much our lives are online, especially so during the past 2 years. So cyber threat intelligence provides an opportunity to take these technical details and build a picture of the threat. Regardless of the name or the face or the logo, every intrusion attempt, every spear phishing email has a story to tell. And one of the first stories that cyber threat intelligence told was the Cuckoos Egg by Cliff Stoll. And if you joined us early and you got to hear some of Rick's fun trivia around the CTI Summit, Cliff actually keynoted the 2017 CTI Summit, which is where we got this quote. In addition, the book, The Cuckoos Egg, and I'm realizing we do have a lot of new folks. So for a quick synopsis, if you haven't read it, first of all, absolutely, please read this book. If you're new to this field, it can be life-changing. But the summary is, there were hackers breaking into government and military networks in the 1980s. And this activity was identified by a systems administrator who picked up on a billing error in the system. You had to pay for the time that you were using the computer systems and somebody wasn't paying. So of course, that began Cliff down a journey, which he calls to track a wily hacker, where he ended up connecting printers to the phone lines, sleeping on a basement, writing down tons and tons of information in a notebook until he could build a story and build a picture of what was going on this network. But that was only the beginning of his story, because once he found out what was going on, he actually had to convince people that it was important and that they needed to do something about it. And that is where this quote came from. I thought all I had to do was show people the data and they would understand, but it doesn't work. You have to tell a story. The Cuckoos Egg also has a special meaning to me personally. I started my career in cyber threat intelligence as a Marine. I had done about 8 years as a traditional intelligence analyst focusing on national security and counterintelligence. And when you're in the military, and if I have any active duty or any veterans, and here you understand this, you don't always have a choice with what your next duty assignment is or your next job is. Even if you think you're really good at the thing you're doing now, that doesn't always matter as much as one might hope. And so I was given an assignment to our new cyber unit as an intelligence analyst. And they tried to assure me that, I was going to be fine. It was going to be great. It was the same things I was doing, intelligence analysis, just with computers. But I was really not excited because I didn't think that it would capture my interest and it wouldn't let me solve the complex puzzles that I loved in the work I was doing. But luckily, we have I don't know if people know this, Marines are voracious readers. So we had a book assigned to us each month. And at the beginning of my new unit's tenure, we were assigned to read A Cuckoos Egg. And that completely changed my viewpoint on not just the job, but what I could bring to the table. I understood not just that there were absolutely puzzles that we could put together and new puzzles that not everybody knew what they looked like and how to shape them, but that I could also bring my communication skills and my storytelling ability to help people understand what was going on. So again, Master Gunnery Sergeant Gibbons, Dr. Gibbons now, I believe, was our senior enlisted at the time, and he was the one who told us to read the book. So if you're ever listening to this, thank you. That set me on a trajectory that brought me here, keynoting on the same virtual stage that Cliff Stoll once stood on. As analysts, we have this sort of superpower of looking at things like log files and intuitively seeing the path our adversaries took and what they were after. But what's important to note is that this superpower is unique to us. It is not intuitive to everyone else. So our job isn't just to show someone the log files. Our job is to bring our insight and connect it to others via story. So story is so important to CTI. I think so. Cliff thinks so. Master Gunnery Sergeant Gibbons thinks so. And so it's important to know how we can leverage this in the critical work that we do. I'm also a big fan of Rebekah Brown, and I love her podcast, Dare to Lead. She starts each interview with, she has some really, really great key influential folks on there, but she always starts off by asking them to tell their story. And this isn't just an exercise in vanity, letting someone talk about themselves. Usually they start way back in childhood, and that is usually not a flattering place to begin one's story. But the reason this story is so important is because it gives the listeners context into their lives and how they approach the world. And it sets the stage to receive the information that they're going to be passing on via this podcast. Story serves as a connective tissue between people. It connects the person telling the story with the audience. It connects what happened in the past with what's happening now. And it connects what's happening now to what we think may happen in the future. Since the one telling the story is typically the one talking, especially if it's a written format, you're kind of just conveying information to people. Establishing that connective tissue is really, really important. There's a quote I love, and it is, there are two ways to share information. You can push it out, or you can pull people in with story. For what we do, and especially with as high stakes and as complicated as some of the things we're trying to pass on are, we will be far more effective if we can set that stage and make that connection so people listen. If we can convey, why does this matter to the person who's reading it, then we can actually get them to pay attention and to draw their own insights. Another thing that I love about story as connective tissue is that when we collaborate in our field, sometimes it can be something like reading a report or giving a brief. But often it turns into a conversation. And that's why I love things like our Slack channels that we have for this summit, is it turns just one person telling their story from their perspective into more of that game that I know you might have played it as a kid, but each person goes around and one person starts with a sentence and someone adds on and someone adds on. And you end up telling this story that is completely different than maybe the person who started it thought it was going to be. But by adding everyone's perspectives and allowing them to tie in and see how it relates to their piece, you can actually come out with a far more better, more cohesive story than if you tried to do it alone. However, with great power comes great responsibility. Truth is critical to the work that we do. And it's also really, really hard to land on. Often when we are sharing insights or displaying something in a story format to someone, it's not just based on facts. We're not just showing someone the log files. We're sharing our insights and our judgment. And this should really be based on our best judgment. When we have people's attention, it's easy to try and learn what is going to make them tick. And what can we say? How can we phrase something in a way that is going to get them to act? And when we do that, it is really important that that information be truthful and accurate. There's no place in our field for intentionally misrepresenting or misinterpreting facts to push an agenda, no matter how honorable that agenda is. If we put information out into the world that isn't accurate and that we know isn't accurate, and people start leveraging that and pulling it into their own story and pulling it into their own insights, we don't know what side effects that might invoke. And so it is really important to have integrity in the stories that we tell. We're not fiction writers, at least not in this job. I actually know a lot of really great CTI analysts who write some good science fiction, but they keep those works separate. Now, that doesn't mean that we're always going to get everything right all the time, right away. There is a lot of the work that we do is based off of incomplete information, and there's uncertainty. And on top of that, we're often working against an adversary who is intentionally trying to make sure we don't have the full picture. So we do have to share and analyze to the best of our ability. But we should always be on the lookout for new information being introduced that might change that narrative or might change how we recommend someone acts. And when we get that new information, or when we uncover a mistake that we find, maybe we misanalyzed or misinterpreted a piece of data previously, it's really important to correct that mistake. Again, we're building a body of knowledge. We are putting things out for other people to use in ways that we may not anticipate. And having accurate information out there is very important. And it's also a sign of courage in the field. If you say something wrong, honestly make a mistake, and you go back out and say, you know what, we have new information, this is actually the case, or this is actually what we recommend, that shouldn't be viewed as a mistake. That should be viewed as learning. And there is no CTI field without learning. So not only do we as individuals need to feel comfortable with our analytic capabilities to come out and say when we have changed our assessment, but as leaders, we need to encourage that in the people who are working for us. And as spectators, even on Twitter, it's important to know that people correcting information or updating an assessment is probably one of the bravest and most useful parts of our field. So we don't get to good, accurate stories by accident. excuse me, I forgot I had a slide in here. So the last aspect of stories is that they drive action. So unlike, like I mentioned, some of the folks out there who write fiction novels or other types of work, this isn't meant to be light reading for someone at the end of a hard day. We're conveying information that someone needs to act on. This can be through direct recommendations. If we think we have a good idea of what needs to be done in response to the adversary that we're talking about, we can provide those directly. But it can also be through changing people's perspectives, helping them understand more about the nature of an activity or an adversary that they might not have known before. Changing perspectives is especially important when we're dealing with fields where we're not experts in ourselves. And we might not know the best course of action, but we can provide information to people who do. One example of this is work that I've done in the past on the wastewater system. I have some experience with water and wastewater. I talk about my mom a lot. She is a wonderful human being. She has a PhD in wastewater. And so she will frequently come to me and ask me like cybersecurity questions, or I read about this attack, or what should I do? And I can tell her about the attack, but I can't tell her what that necessarily means to her, bioorganic system that's growing bugs that eat parasites out of water. Again, I'm not entirely sure what she does, but it's wonderful. So I need to be able to provide information that she can use to say, okay, I understand what this means for me. Maybe I didn't think this was important before, but now it is. And we can only do that when we are humble enough to know that we're not experts in everything. But we can also use story to build knowledge. And this is why it's so important that that knowledge is accurate and that we update it when situations change. Because I might put a report out on an adversary activity that I see that maybe no one else is seeing right now. But by having that accessible and searchable and accurate and up to date, hopefully with a date on it as to when I put that information out there, maybe when Rick or Katie come across that information, they can take what I've learned, build it into theirs, and continue to grow the canon in our field. So regardless of whether there is a specific actionable item that you want to tell someone to do, it's important to remember that the stories we write, we don't write them for ourselves. We write them for other people. And we want it to be in a way that they can use it. So how do we get to the point where we are writing or telling or sharing stories that are helping people make the right decision about things? It isn't by accident. It comes from the second core element of cyber threat intelligence, which is systems. And I'm not talking here about computer systems or a system that we build to automate to do something, although maybe that ends up being the solution. But the systems here I'm talking about can also be known as processes. It's a set of principles or procedures according to which something is done. It can be an organized framework or a method. I am a systems thinker. I view things in connections, understanding how one action might impact other actions. I love systems analysis. If you've taken Forensics 578 and seen the systems analysis slides, those were ones I insisted on sticking in there just because it's so important to me personally. But it makes sense to me that I also love systems in general. So we have some great framework and methods in CTI already. Things like the diamond model, the cyber kill chain, the attack framework. But how and when we use these tools are what truly makes up our systems. James Clear has an amazing book called Atomic Habits, where he touches on the key components of systems, which I think is sometimes in direct contradiction to the way we like to do things, primarily in incident response and in cyber threat intelligence. He talks about the importance of building these systems in a way that we can work on them in an iterative manner, that we can day by day go through this process and become better and smarter and more efficient at them. And because of that, it really is the consistency of the systems and not the intensity that matters. James even goes on to say that our systems are the most important factor in whether a person is successful in achieving their goals. One example of this is the Olympics. So everyone who is participating in an event at the Olympics has the goal of winning the Olympics, but not everybody can actually win the goal or can win the gold medal. Just having the goal doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be successful. What actually makes people successful, what makes them win, are the systems they build, their practice, their training regime, the habits that they've been developing over years, their coaching systems, the best processes for self-reflection and improvement. All of those done consistently will provide far more success than somebody who just sets the goal and says, I'm going to win the Olympics. So for us in CTI, this adds an extra layer of complexity because first, we have adversaries who are working against us. They have goals that are typically the exact opposite of our goals. And in addition, we rarely have static goals. And sometimes the goals we set are not even completely achievable goals. We can't win the internet. We can't prevent all attacks from happening 100% of the time. So instead of being goal-driven, we should strive to be systems-driven. So how do you build a good system? Well, that depends. As we know, that is the standard answer, and you're going to hear it so many times throughout this summit. And I'm actually pretty impressed that I made it like 15 minutes without saying it. But best systems for the task will be based on a lot of different factors. But luckily, there is a system for building systems. The first part is framing the problem. And then you use that to leverage systems thinking and designs thinking into developing requirements, something I know Rick is very excited about. So what exactly is systems thinking and design thinking, and how do they connect the problem with the solutions we eventually end up implementing? Systems thinking means we think of the interconnected parts that are critical to addressing the problem and to meeting our requirements. If the problem is that your organization can't keep up with all of the media reporting on threats that exist and you don't know what you might need to respond to, your system thinking will start enumerating all of the very components required in addressing that problem. You'll need news feeds. You need a threat model. You need people to review those feeds and the models. Those people need the time and space free from other fires to do the analysis, to update the threats, to update your models. You need a mechanism to disseminate the report to those who need it. You need to figure out who actually needs to receive this information. Design thinking is another area that's incredibly useful to building systems because designers focus on addressing problems by building solutions, and they rarely get the design right the first time. Instead, they work on rapid prototypes that show whether a specific design meets their needs. If it doesn't, they address the prototype, or they just go back to the drawing board to the beginning. When we start to design a system to meet a need, we have to be careful not to get stuck on the first idea we had. There was a tweet recently from Christian, another good friend of ours in CTI, which was a blank spreadsheet that said threat intelligence categorization framework. And a lot of times this is what happens when we start our system thinking that we know the answer already without going through this process. And I felt a little called out because I went back through my Google Drive and I saw how many documents I've started that had like grand titles like ground truth in threat intelligence or system for categorizing systems, and then just nothing in there. When we go in thinking we already know the solution and we know what we need to do, and we skip going through this process of framing the problem and using systems and design thinking to build a system that is going to address all of our needs in a way that allows us to be consistent, we're going to be stuck with just a grand title and no data. So there's another aspect to just building the system that's going to depend, or that is going to help us build the right system. This is the Cynefin framework, which means habitat. And the reason it's named that is because a habitat contains a lot of different types of actions that we need to respond to, a lot of different systems of different natures that all interact with each other. It is a truly complex environment. And the problems and the issues are varying complexity, but at the end of the day, they're all things we need to address. It's been described as a sense-making device rather than a categorization model, because you can't always put things into one particular bucket, but that can allow you to understand, to assess the problem that you're dealing with, to identify what type of system you might need to build. It's based off the concept of ordered systems. So you have ordered systems, disordered systems, which are complex systems, and chaotic systems. And ordered systems are split into simple and complicated. So simple systems, or obvious systems, as sometimes people like to use, are problems that are well understood and the solutions are evident. There is a very clear cause and effect model. When you have this type of situation, you can implement a well-known system. This is a place where a lot of our industry best practices thrive. You can use something like the diamond model consistently to address certain types of problems, or the kill chain is another example. When you know that an intrusion has a series of steps, you can use a system to map them out. Now, the reason I prefer this to be called an obvious framework rather than a simple framework is when we view something as simple, it's actually easier to think that we can cut corners or skip it entirely and have the same outcome. What is important here with simple systems is that even if they are not complex, they still require that consistency that James Clear talked about. So an example of this is, I mentioned Scott Roberts. He and I are doing a second edition of Intelligence-Driven Incident Response. And I'm very excited about that. We've been working on it for a few months now. And we have our outline. We know what sections we want to add. We know what things we want to update, what new models we want to bring in. It is a well-known system, and we can implement kind of the best practices. But telling myself that it's a simple process does not make it any easier to sit down every single day and actually do the writing and do the work that is going to make this an effective system. So when you're dealing with a situation that you think is a simple situation, you need to build out not just the system, but build in the time to build those habits and build that consistency. And that's doubly true of systems that you might think are simple. The next situation are complicated situations. So again, this is still an ordered system. There is cause and effect. We generally understand it. However, this is the area where you start getting into not a clear best practice, but several good practices that would probably all work in the situation. And so this is when you need to start pulling in expertise. People can help identify and implement which system is going to be best. Subject matter experts are critical for these complicated systems. Another thing that's also really important to remember with complicated systems, if you're a manager, is that you need to defer to the people who are the experts in whatever the situation is, rather than trying to dictate what you think is the best model. Because in these situations, your perspectives might be different. And you might be dismissing someone else's really, really good idea and asking them to implement it in a way that makes sense to you, rather than in a way that makes sense to them and it is equally sufficient. So the difference between simple and complicated systems is really best practices versus picking the best out of good practices. So complex systems, I think this is the area where a lot of us in CTI thrive. Most will find ourselves often facing truly complex situations. So we may need to spend a great deal of time framing the problem, prototyping through, using that design thinking to say, okay, is this working? Is this not working? And with complex systems, sometimes when things aren't working, the problem is not actually with the system you're trying to implement. The problem might actually be that you framed it incorrectly, and you have to go back to that problem framing stage and restart to make sure that you do understand all of the facets and all of the aspects of this issue so you can build a system that is going to address it. This is the space where a lot of our field's really, really tough problems exist. A lot of people find this to be the most rewarding environment, but it can take a lot of time and it can be quite mentally exhausting to spend too much time only focusing on complex problems. So the goal is not to spend all of your time here, as exciting as it can be to dive into some of these really complex problems and systems. So speaking of places we do not want to spend a lot of time, chaotic systems. When you're in a chaotic space, things have gotten out of hand and you need to respond immediately in many cases. And you don't always have time to go through and gather all of the information that you need to really properly frame a problem and iterate through different types of systems the way you would with a complex system. Often when you enter the chaotic space intentionally, it is for innovation, but most often we enter it by accident because of a crisis. Chaotic situations highlight gaps in our systems. Again, if you're in there for innovation, you're highlighting a gap in an area, an opportunity you have to make things better. But if it's a chaotic crisis, you miss something, some system, some process somewhere that led to this chaotic state. So it's important to get through this, but afterwards, we need to make sure we follow up and come up with a response and really do a good after action to say, how did we get here? What could we have done better? Did the way we address it actually address it? Or do we need to go back and continue to build a better system to fix it for the future? So a lot of these spaces, they don't stay static. As we better understand and define complex problems and build systems that support them, we can actually start to move them towards better understanding. We can identify that cause and effect. We can know the impact an action will have on one aspect of the system and start to build good practices and best practices around that. It's also important to note that chaotic problems, especially when they emerge as a crisis, often have best practice solutions that we just overlooked and didn't implement previously. There is one more aspect to this framework, and that is this space of disorder here. Disorder doesn't speak to the nature of the situation itself, but it speaks to a miscategorization or a lack of understanding of the true nature of a system. This is also a problem we run into a lot. And we often err towards thinking something is overly simple when it really is complex. I think this every time somebody looks at a company that experienced a breach or had an intrusion or is dealing with some issue and says, well, this would have been solved with best practices. Without understanding the full nature of a complex problem, when you oversimplify things, you can also run the risk of shifting yourself over into that chaotic space. So one of the big issues with CTI, and we're going to dive into this next, is that the more problems that arise, the more especially complex or chaotic problems that arise, and this is an area where a lot of us think we thrive, the more mentally taxing it is. And the more taxing something is, the more our analytic skills actually decrease and we shift more towards assumptions and lean back at experience. We give into our biases, we give into the noise, and we can shift into that disordered state where we're not accurately identifying the true nature of an issue. And of course, when you don't understand the true nature, you can't use any of these systems accurately. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is ourself. All intelligence analysis requires humans. We have a lot of tools. We've built a lot of systems we've built to help augment that. But at the end of the day, we truly require human discernment to make judgments about the situation, pulling in lots of different facts. But at the same time, we're being bombarded by other stimuli, subliminal information, and internal forces we know nothing about. Robert Sapolsky wrote a really great book called Behave. It's like 900 pages of history and anthropology and neurobiology. So if you ever can't sleep, I definitely recommend it. But it really did shine a light onto how much our minds and our thinking are influenced, not just by external forces, by internal forces as well. So this yellow part of the brain is the anterior cingulate cortex. It's not completely understood. No part of our brain is completely understood. But we do know that it plays a very important role in cognition, including decision-making, empathy, and parts of functional memory, especially where patterns come into play. Now, I'm not a neurobiologist, but I did read that 900-page book by Robert Sapolsky. And I also just finished up a series of courses on neuroleadership, which helped me understand how you can leverage principles of neurobiology to be a better leader. And I cannot read about types of brain function without trying to apply it to CTI analysts, who are some of the most fascinating thinkers that I know. And one of the very interesting hypotheses I have that no one has so far let me test out because no one will give me access to a functional MRI machine, is trying to understand the difference or the association between people who are really, really brilliant at pattern analysis, at picking up anomalies and understanding small deviations and baselines, like Cliff Stoll, picking up that 8 cents billing error. And people who have a really hard time dropping things or saying, this is good enough, I can let this go. A lot of times, the same superpowers we have that allow us to pick up on a pattern and dig into it and identify something is wrong can actually work against us when it comes time for us to say, I'm carrying too much cognitive load, I'm not thinking clearly, I'm going to let this problem rest and come back to it tomorrow. And I think that that is one of the most important skills that we need to learn as CTI analysts, is where our own limitations are and where our skills actually start to work against us. I love thinking about cognitive skills. It's almost like playing cards. If you're a leader and you're building a team, Katie talked about encouraging diversity, how we need so much diversity in this network, is because the more diverse your organization, the more diverse the cognitive skills you're bringing to the table are. And you really do want to have people who have strengths in all of these different areas. Sustained attention, inhibitory control, processing speed, cognitive flexibility is very important, especially when we talked about storytelling and introducing new information and being able to quickly see how that new information can build into what you already know, and being comfortable adapting. Cognitive flexibility is, I think, one of the skills that we need to foster more to allow us to really continue to grow and to be okay with the fact that we're always learning. Selective attention is also important because it allows us to dive into things when they're important. But like I mentioned before about sometimes our tendency as analysts to never let things drop. If you can move your attention to something else, you can actually free up space in your brain to think more clearly about the problems at a future time. Working memory, category formation. I think we have a lot of folks with strengths in category formation. Every time we come up with a new framework or model, I can really see those people with strengths in category formation just shining. And then pattern recognition, which is one of my strengths. And again, I definitely admit I am one of those people who cannot let things go, especially when I know that it doesn't fit my expected pattern. So a lot of people will have strengths on this list. A lot of people will have areas where they need to improve or that they can grow things. But what we also know about cognition is that across the board, all of these skills get degraded when we're not able to give ourselves that proper care, rest, and support that we need. Sleep deprivation and sleep interruption, even waking up frequently, both impact cognitive performance. So for example, sleep deprivation impacts your working memory. It impacts your cognitive flexibility in particular. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons that we do struggle and we get stuck and mired down in some of the biases when we've been working late nights on an intrusion or patching because of a vulnerability is truly because those skills that we need are degraded. Stress also matters. It activates the amygdala, which controls your body's fight or flight, or freeze functions actually. And it can hijack your cognitive functions. And so this can severely impact things like pattern recognition and again, cognitive flexibility, because your mind is looking for the threats that your body is telling you are out there. You're actually much more likely to attribute anomalies inaccurately to malicious activity when you're under stress, because your body, everything physiologically is telling you that there is a threat there, and you're more likely to see that even if that's not the true nature of the issue. Cognitive load as well, or how many complicated or complex mental tasks you're juggling, impacts focus, working memory, and impulse control. And again, it's a double-edged sword, because the more successful we are at our jobs, the more consistent our systems, the more connecting our stories, the more impact it has on our cognitive load. We're asked to do more. We unearth more connections, more things that we need to identify and categorize. So the first time I read The Cuckoos Egg, and again, if you've read the book, and sorry for spoilers if you haven't read the book, I skipped over. He has all these little sections and tidbits where he talks about his interest in astronomy and cooking, and a lot of like hippie activities. And I'm a hippie leaning person myself, and they were a little bit much even for me. And I glazed over them as tangential or not relevant to what I really wanted to know about, which was this amazing like whodunit hacker mystery. But when I reread the book now, I actually zero in on those sections. And on those details I overlooked and thought didn't matter. They may actually have been part of what enabled Cliff to make those connections he did and to tell his story the way that he did. He knew how to balance his stress and his cognitive load. He knew even when he's sleeping on a basement floor, so he can see when a printer comes up, that there has to be a counterbalance, and he has to do something to regain that state and keep his cognitive performance optimized. So it's easy to say this, rest, sleep, take care of yourself. But if you can actually view this as part of your job requirement, and managers and leaders, if you can view this as a requirement for the folks who are working with you, that if you want their cognitive performance to be best, you want them to get answers sooner, collaborate better, and be thinking more clearly, you need to build in time for their brains to get back to homeostasis. Don't keep them sleep deprived. Don't keep them under stress. Don't constantly toss the same or complex problems on the same person just because they're good at it. Because without that balance, it actually impacts our analytic capabilities, and we won't be able to move forward as a field. So if you're anything like me, the past few years have been a bit draining. The cognitive load I carry has been overwhelming at some times. My systems are sporadic at best. Sometimes I have neither consistency nor intensity. And the stories can get a bit redundant as we feel like we're dealing with the same problems over and over. But once again, that's why this is one of my favorite events of the year. It recharges me, even though it is almost 7 a.m. now here on the West Coast. And I should be practicing what I preach about sleep deprivation and sleep interruption. But coming here and being around all these people, all the creative thinkers, and seeing what they're learning and how they're trying to approach not just CTI in general, but CTI during a chaotic 2 years where we've had a pandemic and just all sorts of crazy things going on. It reminds me that things are hard, but in CTI, we can do hard things. We're not set on a fixed path. We're creating our own future by coming together and sharing our stories, seeing how others have built practices that support their work, and more than anything else, looking out for one another.